There's something almost unbearably ordinary about the last hour of your life. No dramatic music, no slow motion montage, no narrator solemnly explaining what's happening. For most people, the vast majority, in fact, the final 60 minutes look nothing like what movies and television have taught you to expect. The room isn't brightly lit and full of tearful gathered family delivering perfectly timed last words. It's usually quieter than that, slower, more biological, and in some ways more strange and more fascinating than any dramatized version could capture. This video is about what is actually happening to your body, to your brain, to your senses, to your chemistry in the last 60 minutes of life. Not in a morbid way, in a here's what the science actually says way, which is honestly far more interesting than you'd expect. Because some of what happens in those final minutes is genuinely extraordinary. There are brainwaves firing in patterns linked to vivid consciousness. There are neurochemicals flooding your system that researchers think might be responsible for the most profound experiences a human being can have. There is even, according to science, a very real chance your final hour includes something that looks, from the outside, like the most intense dream of your life. So let's walk through it, minute by minute, system by system, from the first visible signs that the end is approaching, all the way to the last electrical signal your brain ever produces. To understand the final hour, you have to understand what the body is doing in the days and hours leading up to it. Because the ending doesn't start when you'd think it does. The dying process in most natural deaths is gradual. The heart begins to pump a little less efficiently, blood moves more slowly around the body. The brain and organs start receiving less oxygen than they need to function normally, and the body, in response, begins a quiet, systematic shutdown of non essential systems to redirect what little energy remains to the ones it considers most important for survival. This isn't a decision being made anywhere. It's just the body following the physics of its own deterioration, doing what systems do when they run out of power, prioritizing the core processes and letting everything else go dark. By the time you're in the final hour, this process has been underway for a while. The person is usually deeply unconscious or drifting in and out of a state that's hard to classify as either sleep or wakefulness. Blood pressure is falling. The extremities, the hands and feet, are cool to the touch and may have taken on a bluish or mottled appearance, sometimes called livido reticularis, as circulation retreats from the body's edges and concentrates around the vital organs. The legs and feet can develop a purplish, blotchy discoloration that healthcare workers recognize immediately as a sign the body is in its final hours. The face, too, changes. The muscles relax in ways they rarely do during normal sleep. The jaw may slacken, the skin can take on a waxy, pale, or slightly yellow quality. The eyes, even if partially open, tend to be unfocused, with the irises drifted upward or to the side. If you've been at the bedside of someone in their final hours, you know this look. It's unmistakable. It's not sleep, even though it resembles it. It's something further. Now here's where it starts to get genuinely strange. Breathing changes dramatically in the final hour, and the way it changes is one of the most clinically reliable signs that death is close. The pattern has a name: Cheney-Stokes respiration, named after the two physicians who first described it in the early 1800s. What it looks like in practice is this: cycles of breathing that build and then fall away. Several breaths in a row, getting a little deeper, a little faster, and then tapering off into shallower and shallower breaths, followed by a pause where breathing stops altogether. These pauses, called apneas, can last anywhere from a few seconds to nearly a minute. And then the cycle begins again. For the person dying, this is not uncomfortable. The brain's oxygen sensing mechanisms are going offline, so the desperate urge to breathe that you'd feel if you held your breath isn't being triggered the same way. The brainstem, the most ancient part of the brain, the part that controls automatic breathing and heartbeat, is still trying to maintain its rhythms, but it's working with less and less to go on. The Cheney-Stokes pattern is essentially that brainstem doing its best with a failing system. It's the biological equivalent of a car engine sputtering on an almost empty tank. For the people in the room, it's one of the hardest things to witness. Watching someone stop breathing and waiting, sometimes for 30 or 40 or 50 seconds, for the next breath to come, and then watching them breathe again and starting the count over, is an experience that stays with you. Hospice nurses and physicians are trained to explain it, to normalize it, to tell families that this is not suffering. But knowing that doesn't make it easy to watch. Alongside the breathing changes, something else often happens that's equally distressing for observers: a sound. Hospice workers call it the death rattle, a term that sounds harsh but describes something that's actually medically quite benign. As swallowing reflexes weaken, saliva and mucus accumulate in the back of the throat. The breath passing through those secretions creates a gurgling, rattling sound with each inhale and exhale. Medical evidence is consistent on one point here. This sound is not a sign of distress or pain in the dying person. It sounds terrible. It is, by all accounts, not terrible to experience. Most people at this stage are deeply unconscious and unaware of it, but the people sitting with them hear it. And that sound, more than almost anything else at the end of life, is what stays in the memory of the people left behind. Let's talk about the brain, because this is where things become genuinely extraordinary. For most of the history of medicine, death was understood as a relatively simple off switch. The heart stops, blood flow ceases, the brain runs out of oxygen, and everything goes dark. A sad but mechanically unremarkable conclusion. A shutdown, not an event. What research in the last decade or so has begun to suggest is that this picture is wrong, or at least radically incomplete. In 2013, a team of researchers monitoring the brains of dying rats discovered something that nobody expected. In the seconds immediately following cardiac arrest, the rats' brains didn't go quiet. They exploded with activity. High-frequency brainwaves, gamma oscillations, the same brainwave pattern associated with heightened consciousness, focused attention, vivid dreaming, and memory retrieval, surged to levels actually higher than those recorded during normal wakefulness. The dying brain wasn't powering down. It was briefly and paradoxically going into overdrive. Then, in 2023, researchers published findings from EEG monitoring of 4 human patients who died after removal of life support. 2 of those 4 showed the same pattern. As oxygen levels dropped and the heart stopped, there was a rapid surge of gamma wave activity in brain regions associated with conscious processing. Visual areas, spatial awareness centers, regions involved in integrating sensory information and forming memories. These weren't random noise. They were organized, coherent oscillations of the kind the brain produces during its most active, aware states. What does that mean? Nobody is completely sure. But the hypothesis that researchers keep coming back to carefully, because this is science and not wishful thinking, is that this surge in brain activity might be the neurological correlate of what near-death experience survivors describe. A feeling of profound vividness, a sudden life review, the sense of memories flooding back with extraordinary clarity and emotional intensity. The dying brain, starved of oxygen and with nothing left to lose, may briefly produce one of the most intense conscious experiences in a lifetime. Not as a comfort, not as a design feature, possibly just as a consequence of the chemistry of what happens when the machinery comes apart. Which brings us to the chemistry, because the brain at the end of life is doing something remarkable on a molecular level as well. As the body undergoes the extreme physiological stress of dying, it releases a cascade of neurochemicals. Endorphins, the brain's natural opioids, are produced in large quantities. These are the same chemicals that cause runner's high, that blunt pain during injury, that create feelings of warmth and euphoria during intense physical experiences. In the context of dying, they are thought to buffer pain and contribute to the calm, even peaceful expressions that hospice workers consistently report seeing on the faces of people in their final hours, even when those deaths follow serious illness or injury. Serotonin is released in elevated amounts. Serotonin regulates mood, perception, and consciousness, and elevated serotonin is the mechanism by which hallucinogenic compounds like psilocybin produce their effects. Vivid visual experiences, altered time perception, feelings of universal connection. In the dying brain, rising serotonin may contribute to the hallucinatory quality of the experience. And then there is DMT, dimethyltryptamine, a naturally occurring psychedelic compound produced in small amounts by the human brain, particularly by the pineal gland. It's widely hypothesized, though not yet definitively proven, that the dying brain releases DMT in significantly larger quantities than normal. The evidence for this is partially indirect. Researchers comparing near-death experience accounts to DMT trip reports find the similarities striking enough to be scientifically relevant. Both involve sensations of leaving the body, tunnels of light, encounters with perceived entities, timelessness, and an overwhelming sense of meaning. A 2018 study gave DMT to participants in a controlled clinical setting and found their reported experiences were uncannily similar to near-death accounts in their content, emotional intensity, and structure. Massive releases of adrenaline and noradrenaline are also occurring, the fight or flight chemicals flooding the body in one last survival attempt. These may contribute to the heightened state of awareness that some near-death survivors describe. A system going into maximum effort emergency mode, marshaling every resource it still has access to. The net effect of all this chemistry in the final minutes may be an experience of consciousness that is, by the measures we'd use for any other experience, genuinely intense. Not necessarily painful. Not necessarily frightening. Possibly the opposite. Possibly something closer to transcendence than to loss, though science isn't in a position to make confident claims about that, and it's important to be honest about what we know and what we're speculating. One of the most striking and practically important things that research has established about the final hour is about the senses. Specifically, which ones go first and which one endures the longest. Vision dims early. The eyes, even if open, lose their ability to focus and process. Taste and smell, which are already diminished in the final days, fade further. Touch persists longer than most people expect. The sensation of a hand being held, a gentle touch on the forehead, is likely still being registered well into unconsciousness. Hospice workers and palliative care nurses often tell families to keep touching, keep holding hands, because there is genuine reason to believe that physical contact is still reaching something, even when the person appears completely unresponsive. And then there is hearing. Hearing is the last sense to go. This isn't just folk wisdom passed down through generations of hospice workers. A research team at the University of British Columbia actually tested it, using EEG to measure brain responses to sound in patients who were in the final hours of life and completely unresponsive. The brains of those patients still showed measurable responses to auditory stimuli. The dying brain was still, at some level, processing sound, still registering that something was being said, even if the person couldn't signal awareness in any way. This finding matters enormously for families, because it means that the words you say in that room, even when the person appears to be completely gone, even when they haven't responded in hours, may be reaching them. The voice of someone they love, filtered through whatever remains of their auditory processing, may still be landing somewhere. The researchers who conducted this study were careful not to overclaim. They couldn't confirm whether the dying patients were consciously aware of what they were hearing, but they showed with measurable brain activity that the auditory system was still functioning, still receiving. Hospice philosophy has operated on this assumption for decades. Keep talking, keep saying what needs to be said, keep playing the music they loved, keep being present with your voice even after everything else seems to have faded. The science for once agrees. Let's take a moment to address the near-death experience directly, because it's the part of this topic that generates the most questions, the most hope, and the most controversy. Near-death experiences, NDS, have been reported for thousands of years across virtually every culture, in forms remarkably consistent with each other despite the fact that the people having them had no contact with each other and no shared cultural template for what dying should feel like. Tunnel of light, life review, feeling of overwhelming peace, sense of leaving the body and observing it from above. Encounter with a presence or a figure. Being told it's not time and being sent back. These are not rare experiences. Studies of cardiac arrest survivors consistently find that somewhere between 6 and 12% report some form of NDE. That's not a trivial number of people. And the consistency of the descriptions across cultures, ages, religious backgrounds, and historical periods is one of the features that makes researchers take the phenomenon seriously regardless of what they believe it means. What causes it? The honest answer is, we don't fully know. The gamma wave surge explains some of the neurological substrate. The chemistry, endorphins, serotonin, possible DMT release, explains some of the phenomenology. Oxygen deprivation alone can produce tunnel vision and altered states. The REM intrusion hypothesis suggests that the brainstem, in an emergency, may trigger something resembling a dream state, in a brain that is otherwise becoming unconscious. All of these mechanisms are real and documented. None of them has been definitively shown to be the full explanation. What we can say is that the subjective experience reported by people who have come very close to death and returned is almost uniformly described as positive, not terrifying, not painful, often described as the most beautiful experience of their lives. People who have had NDEs consistently report reduced fear of death afterward, a reorientation toward what they describe as genuinely important in life, and a sense that what they encountered was more real, not less than ordinary waking experience. Science cannot tell you what that means. Philosophy cannot fully tell you what that means. But the data on what people experience and how it changes them is consistent enough to take seriously. In the very final minutes, after the breathing has become agonal, barely present, more like occasional sighs than any recognizable respiratory rhythm, the heart gives its last effective contractions. Blood pressure falls to nothing. The brain, deprived of the oxygen it needs to maintain even the most minimal function, begins to go finally and completely silent. But even this isn't instantaneous. Clinical death, defined as the cessation of heartbeat and breathing, is not the same as biological death, the end of all cellular activity. For minutes after the heart stops, some neurons are still firing. Some cells are still processing whatever remains in the system. The boundary is not a line, but a gradient. And exactly where it falls is something that modern medicine is still actively debating, with real consequences for questions about organ donation, resuscitation timing, and the definition of death itself. The brain's electrical activity, by most measurements, is gone within minutes of the heart stopping. But those final minutes, the gamma wave surge, the neurochemical cascade, whatever subjective experience they may produce, those are genuinely mysterious. They sit right at the edge of what science can observe and what it can explain. And they remain one of the most genuinely open questions in all of neuroscience. What the final hour of life is not, and this is worth saying clearly, is what most people fear. It is almost never characterized by severe pain in cases where there is good palliative care. It is almost never characterized by fear or agitation in the final period of unconsciousness. The bodily changes, the cooling extremities, the altered breathing, the death rattle, are distressing to witness, but are not, as far as medicine can determine, distressing to experience. The brain's own chemistry appears to blunt the sharp edges of the process. What most dying people look like in those final minutes is peaceful, not in a euphemistic, nothing to worry about sense, in an observable, physiological, that's what the face looks like sense. The muscles relax fully in ways they never quite manage during ordinary sleep. The features soften. The body, which has been working so hard for so long, finally stops working. And what remains is still. Whether something else continues, whether consciousness persists in any form beyond the last electrical signal in the brain, is a question that science cannot currently answer, and may never be able to. It is the oldest question, and it remains open. What science can tell us is that the journey to that threshold is far richer, far stranger, and far less bleak than most people imagine. A brain firing in extraordinary patterns. A chemistry producing states of experience that survivors describe as profound. A sensory system holding on to sound, holding on to the voices of the people who matter, longer than almost anything else. A body that is, right up until the very end, doing everything it knows how to do to keep the person inside it present. And then, quietly, it stops. And whatever was there, the accumulated weight of a whole life, every memory, every relationship, every moment of joy and grief an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, either goes somewhere else or it doesn't. Science is still working on that part.